Why are there just two nations occupying that enormous expanse of the North American continent that lies north of the Rio Grande? Why isn't there only one nation, or a good many nations, as in Europe or South America? If we go back to the year 1763, it might seem that the question, how many countries on the continent, was settled once and for all. For in that year, for the first time, the Union Jack flew all the way from Hudson Bay to Florida. Britain had earlier taken Acadia and Newfoundland from France, and now, in 1763, she completed the conquest of New France itself, an area that was already coming to be known as Canada. So now the Union Jack flew over Virginians and Nova Scotians, New Yorkers and Canadians. 17 very different British colonies in North America. In London, the imperial authorities confidently prepared to impose a common pattern on all of them. But Canada was not like the others. It was French and Catholic, and its economic system, based on the fur trade, clashed with that of the other colonies. As New France, Canada had prevented the American colonists from pushing into the interior from the Atlantic coast. Now this obstacle was gone. Settlers from Virginia and Vermont, New Jersey and the Carolinas could push westward into new lands. But the Indians were still in the forests. Nobody had invited these former allies of the French to the peace treaty negotiations. Now they were angry, and they had found a leader.
Pontiac was probably the most formidable Indian warrior politician ever to appear in North America. He and other proud chiefs were uneasy with the new British officers in the former French garrisons. The French had treated the Indians as partners in the fur trade, but the British acted more like masters, aloof and ungenerous. The Indians left their meetings with the British dissatisfied. The end of the war and the disruption of the fur trade had left them far less valuable to the white man. Finally, frustration flared into violence. Pontiac's ferocious onslaught aimed at driving the colonists back from the western frontier, and hardly an English soldier or settler west of Detroit escaped death or capture. The torture of captives revealed the depths of the Indians' hatred. Bloody battles between Indians and veteran British troops showed that neither side would yield and that it was time for negotiation. In an effort to understand the cause of the Indians' fury, the British sent commissioners to question them. From the Indian leaders, like Pontiac, there came impassioned complaints about the expansion westward by settlers from the American colonies. They were pushing through the passes of the Appalachian Mountains, threatening the Indian way of life. By felling trees, clearing the land, and starting farms, they were driving out the animals that the Indians had always hunted for their livelihood. Pontiac reminded the commissioners that some British prisoners had been returned during truces in the fighting. But he warned that unless the British gave heed to the Indians' complaints, there would be no mercy in the future. What the Indians really wanted was the old French system, which left them a vast interior free of settlers. The British, anxious at all costs to put an end to Pontiac's reign of terror, finally agreed. And in 1763, they proclaimed this expanse Indian territory. At the same time, however, new narrow boundaries for Quebec discouraged the former French system. As for settlement, it would be forbidden in the territory beyond the Appalachians. This angered the land-hungry colonists of the Atlantic coast, but they were told that if they could not go west, they could go north to Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, the city of Halifax was founded a quarter of a century before. Its growing port and recently established legislative assembly were held out as attractions for immigrants. Here, then, was an alternative to Western settlement. And another was the province of Quebec, although its appeal was lessened by the fact that its new, constricted boundaries seemed to offer limited possibilities for further settlement. Montreal, flourishing crossroads of the fur trade, and Quebec, the spiritual center of Catholic Canada, were now occupied towns, with the red-coated British soldiers much in evidence. These troops, representing the conquering Protestant power, were under the command of General James Murray, himself a Scottish Catholic. As military governor, he ruled from Quebec, a town that had been left half in ruins by the bombardments of war. These ruins revealed the tragedy of a culture that had been unique in North America. It was a European culture, dominated by a strong religious belief. It was authoritarian, but not oppressive, and it had its admirers as well as detractors in the outside world. But now its French administrators had gone back to Paris, and its commercial life, like many of its buildings, lay in ruins. Left without leaders, the ordinary Canadians, the habitants, carried on as best they could, drawing strength from their religious heritage. This heritage would help them maintain their identity and resist submersion by a conqueror. This was the homeland they had built, the only homeland they knew. There was no question of returning to France, as their leaders had. Now their leadership would come from the church, and it would be their beacon of hope.
In 1760, the French Canadians did seem to be facing a dark future. But they'd been toughened by a long struggle for existence in which they'd often been victims of geography and war and of exploitation by French officials. They had received but fitful support from France, where church and state were preoccupied by a worldwide struggle against Britain and Protestantism. Now, officially ceded to a conqueror, the French Canadians instinctively continued the passionate and persistent defense of their essential nationhood under church leadership. And they were helped in the first critical years by the attitude of Governor Murray, who accepted the reality of the French fact. He quickly sent home the provocative Protestant troops from New England, and he preserved French as an official language for law and administration. Murray's regime was, in fact, more Canadian than that of New France, despite the Redcoats.
But Murray, now civil governor, soon had to face a difficult situation arising out of the fur trade. Here, at Montreal, was the center of the complex trade that the French had built up, blending the skills of the traders and merchants and the canoemen who penetrated far into the interior. From here, the furs had poured across to Paris. But now the flag had changed, and it was the Union Jack that flew over the fur trade. And the whole vast enterprise had fallen into new hands. Hard-headed merchants from Albany, Boston, and faraway London had followed Wolfe to Canada to take over the fur trade. Almost from the outset, they were in conflict with Governor Murray, seeking for themselves strong political powers at the expense of the French Canadians. They were impatient of regulations that hampered their ambitions, which extended far out to the west, to the source of the precious furs. In the west, the new Montreal merchants hoped to perpetuate the partnership that the French had created between Indian and white man. But now, British traders would be at the helm, with French voyageurs manning the canoes. To achieve their goals, the merchants demanded the creation of a legislative assembly which they could dominate, since Catholics could not hold office. But Governor Murray refused to give them this advantage over the French Canadians, for he had come to admire greatly the French devotion to religion and the orderly life that stemmed from this. He found the ruthless ambitions of the merchants distasteful compared with the piety, industriousness, and simple pleasures of the habitants. Thus, under Murray, Quebec was governed not through an elected assembly, but with a small council which the governor appointed.
By making sure that the members of the council were sympathetic to the French, Governor Murray further annoyed the English merchants who wanted special privileges in the fur trade. When they were denied these, they blamed French influence. Thus, from the beginning, the new Canadian partnership was an uneasy one, with the English motivated by the promise of economic gain and the French by the desire for national survival. The French were apprehensive of English exploitation, and the English were impatient with a French conservatism that might obstruct progress. Each group found difficulty in understanding the other's motivations, and here was the beginning of a problem that was to be Canada's biggest burden for 2 centuries, right up to the present day. But at the time, if Governor Murray favored the French, it wasn't simply his admiration for their way of life. He had another motive: to keep Quebec friendly in case the British ever had to face rebellion to the south.
In the English colonies, the presence of many British soldiers meant taxation for the colonists, who had to pay for part of their upkeep. This taxation aroused the anger of men like Patrick Henry, who denounced it in the Virginia Assembly. Here was a tradition very different from that of Quebec: assemblies, local government, and relatively free speech. It was a tradition that went back 150 years. From the earliest days in the colonies, parliamentary notions had encouraged the questioning of authority. And there were even outbursts of defiance, like Bacon's Rebellion in 1675. There was open expression of discontent, in sharp contrast to French Canada, where unrest could find little outlet. Unlike Quebec, the English colonies were familiar with edicts, declarations, and manifestos that reflected political unrest. There could actually be events like the deposition of Governor Andros in Boston, taken to jail in chains. It was against this restless background that Patrick Henry made his passionate attack on Britain for taxing the colonists without their consent. Meanwhile, in the streets, British soldiers guarded bales of paper against an angry populace. This was expensive paper that had to be used under the Stamp Act, a law passed in 1765 that involved taxation of various documents and publications. For many colonists, this tax symbolized tyranny, and there were riots in which the hated paper was burned. The real issue was economic nationalism. Colonial commerce, symbolized by a growing Wall Street, had produced a strong middle class in cities up and down the Atlantic coast. These men had grown wealthy through trade with Africa and the West Indies. Their methods generally defied the strict trading regulations decreed by Britain, and they were strongly opposed to any tightening of controls by the mother country, of whom they were continually reminded by the presence of the redcoats. Before long, many voices joined in denouncing Britain's interference in colonial trade. And there was violence, too, when a mob set fire to the British ship Gaspé, which had been enforcing customs regulations. Then came the famous Boston Tea Party, when colonists, disguised as Indians, hurled chests of tea into the harbor. The tea bore a tax that was particularly detested. North America in Flames proclaimed a cartoon of the time. And in Britain, William Pitt, the former Prime Minister, warned Parliament of the dangers. But Lord North, now government leader, obstinately pursued a course destined to further enrage the colonists. Parliament itself was so embroiled in party politics that there was little time to solve colonial problems. And so, in North America, the flames of discontent grew hotter.
But what about Canada, for so long an effective base against the American colonists? Would the flames of rebellion spread northward? Despite London's hopes, Canada had remained almost entirely French. Governor Murray had been recalled because of complaints by the English merchants about his pro-French policies. But his successor, Sir Guy Carleton, continued Murray's policies, and at his urging, Britain took steps which she felt would ensure the loyalty of the people of Quebec. The Quebec Act of 1774 gave them a larger voice in government by permitting Catholics to hold office under a special oath, and it restored the French system of civil law. But this famous legislation was anything but perfect.
The Quebec Act did recognize that the province was not going to be a colony just like the others. But the new governor, Guy Carleton, had urged that Quebec's unique features be preserved, for he presumed that the reputed obedience of the French-Canadian habitant could be a bulwark against possible rebellion in the colonies to the south. Thus, the new law strengthened the powers of the landowners and clergy, but gave little to the common man. This authoritarian approach reflected Carleton's aristocratic views. There were territorial changes, too, under the Quebec Act, with vast areas to the west making the little colony a giant again. To help govern this expanse, the old council was enlarged, with Frenchmen now sitting beside their English conquerors. Now virtually everything the French had had before the conquest had been returned to them. But for the colonies to the south, it seemed that an old threat had been revived. The Yankee frontiersman now felt himself hemmed in by a wall, behind which lurked an unholy alliance of French Catholics and Indians, backed by the British Army. The French and Indians were the old enemies, and now the colony's expansion to the west seemed permanently blocked by the Quebec Act. In the colonial towns, the voices of protest grew louder and angrier, and the listeners became more attentive. Common grievances against Britain drew the various colonies together, and in 1774, their representatives met in Philadelphia in the First Continental Congress. Among their actions was an invitation to Canada to join them. The colonists felt that the Canadians had everything to gain. Weren't the English merchants dissatisfied? Weren't the French politically oppressed? But the French Canadians had reason to be suspicious, for strong anti-Catholic sentiments were embodied in a resolution that the colonists had sent to London, protesting the concessions that the Quebec Act had made to the Church in Canada. Catholic bishops danced around the Quebec Act in a bitter contemporary cartoon, while the British Prime Minister, Lord North, joined in the fun, and the devil looked on approvingly. Anti-Catholic fury was mounting in Protestant New England, and in the eyes of the colonists, the new situation in Quebec was the work of Satan, leading to hell and damnation. Cartoons depicted Boston imprisoned by harsh British edicts, and as tension grew, 2 colonists and a wild American Indian were shown attacking Britannia. Meanwhile, in Montreal, the influential merchants listened to the sounds of the gathering storm to the south. They too had grievances against the British, so perhaps they would side with the colonists. But as they surveyed their special place in the economy and geography of North America, the merchants found themselves in a dilemma. Most important to the merchants was access to the West with its richness of furs. Their profits depended on Indian hunters and French canoemen to bring the furs out. The capital to finance these ventures and the merchandise that was used in trading came from Britain, and Britain was the main market for the skins. Also, the enlarged Quebec had reunited their fur empire. Many of the Montreal merchants originally came from Albany and New York, so there was sympathy for the colonists. But the flow of furs would be endangered if the colonists had their way and were allowed to settle in the West. This, and the merchants' dependence on London, led them to stop short of active support for the revolution that was about to explode. It was April 19th, 1775. It took place at Lexington and at Concord in Massachusetts. And it came to be known as the shot heard round the world. In the colonial congresses, there was rejoicing over this first victory by amateur American soldiers over hardened British professionals. And it was soon repeated on a larger scale in the bloody battle that was fought below Bunker Hill. In their attack on Bunker Hill, the British lost 1,000 men, twice as many as the Americans. Now the die was cast. There would be no turning back. The Americans felt new confidence in their strength, and the spirit of revolution swept through the colonies. To lead them, the Congress picked George Washington, a veteran of the Indian Wars, who would command an army that had little training, but much enthusiasm.
The Congress rushed a delegation to Canada to renew earlier appeals for support, but they returned disappointed. The English merchants were incensed at French political gains under the Quebec Act, but they liked the new Quebec boundaries, which reunited the old fur trading empire. Breaking ties with London was too risky financially. The merchants saw loss rather than gain in supporting the rebellion. As for the French, their leaders were pleased with an act that increased their privileges. The habitant farmers disliked the act, but their discontent was leaderless, and they were not likely to follow the lead of Protestants and old enemies. The Canadians, it seemed, did not feel that Ben Franklin's old slogan about colonial unity applied to them.
The need for colonial unity did preoccupy revolutionaries like Sam Adams, who might well have felt that the slogan should apply to all North America. After all, the Revolutionary Council called itself the Continental Congress, and its members still believed that the Canadians would rally to the cause once they understood it more clearly. Meanwhile, the war drew closer to Canada when the Americans surprised and captured Fort Ticonderoga, key to the north-south invasion route. Congress could never forget the possibility of attack by the great British ships that lurked in the St. Lawrence and off Halifax. But now, at least Ticonderoga might block the path of any frightening pincer movement by land aimed against the rebellious colonies. But there were still the Indians for the Americans to worry about. Memories of Red Raiders from Canada were still vivid in the colonies. And now perhaps the British would send them on the warpath again. With these fears, the revolutionary leaders started looking to men like Richard Montgomery, who knew the Quebec invasion route well, having fought both French and Indians in the area. If Canada could not be persuaded to join the revolution, then why not take it by force? With this goal, and Ticonderoga as a starting point, Montgomery set out with 4,000 men up Lake Champlain toward Canada. 4,000 men made a formidable force as they approached St. John's on the Richelieu River. There were only 700 British soldiers defending the fort, and the Americans besieged and captured it. Meanwhile, another attack on Canada was being mounted. From the coast of Maine, Benedict Arnold was leading 1,100 men toward the fortress of Quebec. It was an incredible march through the wilderness. Finally entering Canada, Arnold's ragged and starving army got help from local farmers and managed to push on to Quebec. Meanwhile, up the St. Lawrence at Montreal, the military situation was desperate. The governor, Sir Guy Carleton, had expected 18,000 volunteers when he called up the militia, but only a few hundred turned out. Disillusioned, he abandoned the city to Montgomery's Americans and fled down the river. After taking Montreal, the way was now clear for Montgomery and part of his army to proceed to Quebec and confront the city together with Benedict Arnold. Between them, they had about 1,000 men, but no artillery to bombard the fortress. On December 31st, in a blinding snowstorm, the Americans launched a surprise attack. But Montgomery was killed in the attack, for the British had been ready, and by the time the battle was over, more than half the Americans were dead or captured.
It was a disastrous defeat for the Americans, but they didn't give up hope. They were able to maintain the siege of Quebec with reinforcements from the south. At the same time, the revolutionaries still hoped to win over the French-Canadian habitant farmers to their cause. After all, the American defeat at Quebec had been at the hands of British soldiers, not Canadians, for the habitants had mostly refused to join the militia. They had not listened too closely to their leaders either, and an attitude of benevolent neutrality had permitted them to trade with the American invaders. The habitants were clearly unhappy with their lot under British rule. So, couldn't propaganda from the South turn this feeling into a positive pro-Americanism?
With Quebec besieged, the Catholic clergy of the province started playing an increasingly effective role in the struggle for the loyalty of the habitant farmers. This was now being sought by American propagandists who came bearing promises of liberty and equality for all. And it was also being sought by the British. For the habitant, the American kind of freedom might well seem better than the British, which gave the big landowners freedom to collect rent, and the habitants freedom to work hard for little return. But from the pulpit, the clergy warned of the anti-Catholic serpent that lurked behind the Protestant Americans. Much better to side with the British Lion with its proven tolerance toward the church in Quebec. Thus, the clergy stood firm in supporting Britain.
The pro-British stand of the clergy was not entirely disinterested. They sensed that survival could be more difficult for them as well as for French Canada in any larger continental nation that the Americans might envisage. The French Canadians were a deeply religious people, so they took the threat to their religion most seriously. Crude anti-Catholic utterances by the Protestant revolutionary soldiers seemed proof enough of danger, but an increasing American lack of hard cash made neutrality less benevolent. The habitants were by no means indifferent to freedom, but they could hardly be roused by slogans about democratic forms of which they knew next to nothing. Thus, the American propaganda campaign in Quebec failed. But Canada was too strategically vital to the success of the revolution to be easily abandoned. All through the winter of 1776, the Americans built up their forces at Quebec. Meanwhile, the British commander was anxiously awaiting spring, when the Navy would bring fresh troops from England. Canada might still be the base from which the revolution could be destroyed. The Canadian invasion was stuck, but to the south, events were on the move.
At Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, the American revolutionaries had captured a rich prize in artillery, some 59 cannon. With incredible energy, they hauled these across New England to Boston, where they used them to occupy key heights around the city. Even the British fleet that stood off Boston was now in peril. General Howe, the British commander, knew the damage artillery could cause, and now he decided to evacuate. He would sail for Halifax, taking with him the last of the King's forces in New England. A notable victory for George Washington, the revolutionary commander. Now, the next step was up to the politicians. With John Hancock presiding, the Continental Congress was sitting at Philadelphia. The question was, should the colonies declare complete independence from Britain? 5 delegates were given the task of coordinating the resolves of the various provincial assemblies. And in the end, they produced a classic statement of the case for nationhood and self-determination. Middle-class nationalism marched with Republican idealism in this celebrated document, the Declaration of Independence. But the famous document did not win easy acceptance. There was a conservative element that still saw in the Crown the true source of British liberty, and felt their argument was mainly with Parliament. Others feared the full force of British military retaliation, naval bombardment, and scalping parties from Canada. But in the end, the radicals prevailed. Men like John Hancock. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was accepted. And that evening, the news was communicated to the public. It was fateful news, and it was greeted with mixed feelings, for a large segment of the populace was still loyal to King George III. But for the rebellious majority, it was a day to celebrate. In New York, wild crowds rejoiced as they surrounded a statue of the king. His Majesty, melted down, would make bullets for rebel guns. For General Washington, independence meant war. War against former friends. For many revolutionary officers and officers loyal to Britain had once fought together against the French. Now, peace overtures of former comrades would have to be rejected by Washington. It would be a fight to the finish. To challenge the revolutionaries, General Howe now returned from Halifax with a British army of 32,000. His strategy was to seize control of the mouth of the Hudson River and then divide the northern and southern colonies. Fearing Howe's plan, Washington rushed his army south from Boston and engaged the British in a series of confused battles around New York. Howe defeated, but did not destroy Washington, though he did win control of the mouth of the Hudson. As Governor of Canada, Sir Guy Carleton held the key to the second half of Britain's strategy against the Revolution. This would involve a thrust southward to join forces with Howe on the Hudson River to complete the splitting of the colonies. The arrival of General Burgoyne in Quebec in the spring of 1776 meant the plan could be put into effect. Burgoyne had brought 10,000 troops from England, which would be put at Carleton's disposition. The American forces at the gates of Quebec fled post-haste after besieging the city all winter. Half frozen and plagued with scurvy, they headed south, embittered by the knowledge that their Canadian venture, considered so vital by George Washington, had finally ended in failure. Carleton pursued the Americans, but he muffed the chance to catch them. The Americans, now led by Arnold, were able to reach Lake Champlain, and at Valcour Island, they were able to assemble a fleet that could face the British in a naval engagement. It was a rickety makeshift flotilla, but Sir Guy Carleton took months preparing a fleet to challenge it. As naval battles go, this would be a picayune affair. Yet it turned out to be of major importance, for the British would be decisively delayed here in their overall strategy, regardless of the outcome of this battle. The American fleet, manned by landlubbers, was overwhelmingly outgunned, and after formidable and courageous resistance, it was totally destroyed. But the Americans had won precious time for their cause. To strike southward and join forces with Howe in New York. That had been Carleton's plan. But now winter was too close. There would be a delay until next year. Although Washington had lost the battles around New York, a brilliant series of retreats kept his army intact as it moved west toward Pennsylvania. Then on Christmas night, 1776, Washington recrossed the Delaware River eastward to attack in one of history's greatest gambles. The British garrison at Trenton was completely surprised, and the revolutionaries scored an overwhelming victory, with the dying commander surrendering to Washington.
A few days later, there were more victories for Washington as he struck at Trenton again and defeated the British at Princeton. American morale and enlistment, which had been low, revived as Washington settled into winter quarters. Meanwhile, the two main British forces withdrew to New York and Quebec. But surely they'd not stay there for long. By spring, it seemed that Britain was once again going to try to split the colonies along the Lake Champlain-Hudson line. Burgoyne, who had replaced Carleton as commander-in-chief, had planned to swing southward and meet Howe at Albany. But there was confusion, with Howe getting priority for another plan that would first take his forces south rather than north to capture Philadelphia.
General Burgoyne embarked on his campaign with high hopes. Indian warriors were included in his force, and at Lake Champlain, he cautioned them to conduct civilized warfare. But the Indians did come to commit atrocities, confirming the worst fears of the Americans about the savage menace from Canada. It was the familiar invasion route that Burgoyne traveled. His plan was to move south while another British force came east to join him at Albany. Here, a junction would be effected with Howe's forces coming north from New York. But the trouble was that Howe was not coming north, and Burgoyne alone was in growing danger. First, at Bennington, where part of his army met the enemy. At Bennington, American militiamen under General Stark annihilated a large detachment of Burgoyne's army. As for the main force, it soon faced a growing revolutionary army of embattled farmers, frontiersmen, and militiamen. Defeated in two further battles, large numbers of British were taken prisoner. By now, the royal forces were greatly outnumbered and surrounded, and on October 17th, General Burgoyne surrendered to the American commander, General Gates, at Saratoga. It was to be a turning point in the war. Meanwhile, to the south, Washington was keeping Howe's British forces fully occupied, making it impossible for him to come to the assistance of Burgoyne. But the victories here were British, with Howe taking Philadelphia and repelling a spirited American counterattack on Germantown. With heavy casualties, a discouraged Washington had to withdraw for the time being. The year's fighting had ended in stalemate. At Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, Washington reviewed his ragged, weary troops. This was the spot where they would spend the winter, a bleak area where the troops were ill-housed, ill-fed, and ill-clothed. Their miseries revealed how inadequate were the Army's financial resources. for not more than a third of the American population actively supported the revolution. In the bitter cold of winter, many of the soldiers could not leave their miserable quarters for lack of proper clothing. For Washington, it was a time of trial. He had been fighting for 3 years and had kept his army together, a remarkable feat. But victory seemed as remote as ever. Well, he might despair. But in Paris, the American cause was winning new and important support. Benjamin Franklin, the American envoy to France, had completely won over the court with his propaganda. Even King Louis XVI was persuaded, especially after the American victory at Saratoga, that Britain might be defeated. Seeing a chance to strike against her traditional enemy, France signed an alliance with the revolutionaries. Now, at last, Washington might break the stalemate. Now, Washington would have at his side men like Rochambeau, one of the ablest soldiers in all France. And soon Spain threw her weight into the struggle against Britain, as did the Netherlands. Now, counting revolutionary America, there were 4 adversaries against Britain to tip the scales of power. At the Battle of Monmouth in the spring of 1778, the Americans scored heavily against the British, who were withdrawing through New Jersey to New York. Britain's proud flag was being badly torn by the Americans and by the exterminating angel of French vengeance. France's entry into the war drew attention back to Canada once again. For only 20 years earlier, Canada had been French. Now Washington's French allies wanted to mount an expedition to conquer Canada, but Washington held them back. In his eyes, even British rule in Canada was preferable to French, with all its uncertainties. Later, the positions were reversed, and it was the French who held Washington back. They would prefer the continent divided, rather than America all-powerful.
As it happened, British rule in Canada was lucky, for Canada could scarcely have survived if an American army and a French navy had attacked together. For one thing, the appeal that France had for Quebec through language and religion remained strong. French Canadians might well have rallied to the side of the attackers, but that attack was not to be, thanks to differences between the French and the Americans. So instead of coming north, the war shifted south, where the Americans more than held their own. But even though Washington's army was effective, British sea power was his nemesis. The Navy kept Britain's troops highly mobile, withdrawing and then attacking again at will, and Washington feared that sheer exhaustion might yet defeat the Americans.
At Britain's great base at Halifax, in Nova Scotia, her power was very real. Here were to be seen her great ships of the line, with their sinister tiers of cannon. From here, they dominated the North Atlantic and blockaded the American coast. Their presence also helped assure the loyalty of the Nova Scotians, some half of whom came from New England and might have sympathized with the American Revolution. Also, the naval base meant profit for Halifax merchants, and that too helped keep them loyal. From Halifax, British ships were able to swoop down and raid New England towns. There was nothing the Americans had in their little navy that could stand up to these terrible ships of the line. But the answer to British sea power lay at the French naval base at Toulon, where a reorganized fleet planned revenge against the British. These were the ships that blocked the exit from Chesapeake Bay off Virginia in September 1781. Nearby, at Yorktown, the British Army was besieged, and the British fleet would have to push through the French if the 8,000 soldiers were to escape from the trap. The British ships proved unable to break the French line. The battle lasted 5 days, during which the badly managed British fleet was completely outmaneuvered and outfought by the French Admiral de Grasse. The British sailed off, leaving no choice for the commander of the British Army, Cornwallis, but to surrender. A sweet day for France, but sweeter still for Washington, as Cornwallis and the last great British army outside New York filed past and stacked their arms. Washington had won his war. King George III was being thrown by the angry horse, America. The colonies were casting off their imperial master with the help of the hated flag of France. Another cartoon of the day showed a British admiral tied to a tree. He stood for the hapless Royal Navy, which was having its wings clipped, not only off America, but in other oceans. The once proud fleet was in disgrace, its claws shorn by Holland, France, Spain, and the United States. As for British merchants, they were wailing in despair at the fate of the cow of commerce. While America sawed off her horns, Holland was milking her, and France and Spain eagerly awaited their turn. Every cur could now insult the British lion, so low had he sunk.
The American colonies might once have settled for less, but now it had to be complete independence from Britain. By now, even stubborn King George III had realized that the time had come to negotiate a peace treaty. But what would this mean for Canada? She had survived attacks and near attacks from the Americans, but would she be able to survive the peace negotiations? Would the shrewd Benjamin Franklin try to gain at the conference table what his compatriots had failed to achieve on the battlefield? For Canada, everything would depend on the final boundaries that would now be drawn. But the peacemaking would not be a simple matter. In the complex claims and counterclaims of the nations, Canada's interests could all too easily become obscured.
The former belligerents, Britain among them, came to the peace negotiations parading their wounds, the amputations of war, and asking for damages. France demanded compensation in the West Indies and sought influence over the new United States. The Dutch, for their sacrifices in the sea war against Britain, sought advantages in trade and commerce. As for the Spaniards, they hoped to gain Gibraltar and sought to keep America out of the West, away from Louisiana. Only the United States emerged with an uncomplicated goal: freedom under its new flag. Shrewd Ben Franklin represented the United States in the peace talks, as did John Jay and another hard bargainer, the tenacious John Adams of Massachusetts. In redrawing the map, would the peace treaty recognize the extensive Canada of the Quebec Act? This was anathema to the Americans, who asked for a United States that would include all of Canada. But the British, difficult as their position was, rejected this arrogant request. The Americans, however, already had a toehold in the West. At Vincennes in Indiana, George Rogers Clark had attacked a British frontier fort with a small group of Americans. The surprised British commander had surrendered this strategic outpost. But the West, despite Clark's victory, was still mainly held by the British. Nevertheless, the Americans' next suggestion was for a Canada confined to the narrow boundaries of 1763, which cut it off from the interior. With these dimensions, Canada would have lost almost all of the modern province of Ontario. Yet the British were inclined to accept these limits, for they had ended the war facing an overwhelmingly powerful coalition, in which America was flanked by Imperial France and Imperial Spain. But just then, at the critical moment, A victory at sea over the French served to stiffen London's resolve. It was the Battle of the Saints in the West Indies. And late in 1782 at Gibraltar, there came another boost for Britain's battered prestige. France and Spain had joined to mount a mighty naval onslaught against the British-held Rock. But the defenders brilliantly repelled the attack, inflicting fearful losses on the enemy. The rather tattered lion could bite after all. Britain could now face her enemies with more confidence and could now disturb the Americans with bold counterclaims in North America, including all of the Ohio-Mississippi Triangle. And on top of this, the Americans faced trouble with their allies. For Washington had not won the war alone. The French had been of immeasurable help. But now, facing peace, the partners viewed each other with increasing suspicion. America, dangerous. France, cold, selfish, calculating. This was how they came to see each other. France, now motivated by a need to help Spain, suggested a new plan, a huge Indian buffer state, which would keep the United States away from the Spanish Mississippi. In the menagerie of powers, there was a regrouping of former allies. The buffer state idea would smother America's Western ambitions. To get rid of it, the Americans tried to persuade Britain to give them the Ohio Valley. In return, they offered a northern boundary at the 45th parallel, one which would have lost southern Ontario for modern Canada. If this was unacceptable to the British, they offered a line following the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, the line we know today. This the British finally accepted, and a peace treaty was signed. Britain had controlled a huge area in the interior. Why had she been willing to abandon it in this 1783 treaty? Why was the defeated Britannia so eager to embrace her wild, rebellious offspring? Basically, it was because Britain was less interested in keeping the Ohio Valley than in detaching the United States from the grasp of France and Spain. These two would continue to be the enemies of Britain, but perhaps the new American Republic could become a friend. So Britain was generous. It was November 25th, 1783, and Britain's troops were about to sail home from New York, where they had been quartered during the long peace negotiations. It was 8.5 years since the shot heard round the world had been fired in Massachusetts. As the guns boomed and the crowds cheered, a new flag replaced the old one. This was the end of more than a century and a half of British rule in this part of the New World. The map now showed a United States that had the territory it wanted, west to the Mississippi. The world should now picture America and Britain in sweet reconciliation. At least that was what Britain hoped. But it was not that easy. The peace treaty brought relief, but the salty cartoonists of the time showed the nations of the world in a malicious chorus that mocked the British loss. Perfidious Albion was getting its just deserts, and its enemies gloated in the savage and uninhibited style of the 18th century. Poor John Bull. Crocodile tears were being shed for him. But for some, there was a real sense of loss in the amputations inflicted on the English-speaking world. It would take a long time for the wounds to heal. And when a famous artist set out to paint the peace conference delegates, the Americans were only too happy to be included. But the British delegates didn't show up for the sitting. And thus the painting remained, ominously unfinished.
America now had her independence, and now at last she could start to fulfill a destiny already dimly felt by the revolutionaries, to expand over all the continent. But would it be the whole continent? So far, Canada had survived, but would the United States turn hungry eyes northward again? Would Canada remain in pawn in the game of Anglo-American relations, always a potential sacrifice to British interests? The Ohio Valley had already been thrown away by Britain, Canadians felt. With dismay, the merchants of Montreal had seen the great fur-trading empire divided once again because of new frontiers. Was there any future at all for this narrow land that had Ontario as its western boundary, especially beside this immensely more powerful neighbor that had been born out of hatred for Britain, Canada's master? These were the questions for Canadians in 1783.